The news came to Min Seo on a Tuesday morning while she was drinking coffee in her apartment on Earth. The message appeared on her screen in bright blue letters, and at first she thought it was a mistake. She read it 3 times before she believed it was real. The Galactic Council had chosen her. They had chosen her to represent humanity in something called the Unified Intelligence Protocol. She was not the first choice. Dr. Hai-Il, the famous physicist, had been chosen first. Commander Teo, the military leader with 30 years of experience, had been chosen second. Min Seo was the third choice, the backup option, the one they picked because they needed someone who spoke languages and understood different cultures. She was a linguist. She studied how people from different planets communicated with each other. She had never been to space before. She had never even been on an airplane more than twice in her life. But the message was clear. She had 72 hours to prepare. A ship would come to pick her up. She would travel to a station called the Neutral Sphere, and she would compete against the smartest representatives from 100 different alien species. Min Seo put down her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking. The ship arrived exactly on time. It was not what she expected. She had imagined something metal and cold, full of blinking lights and beeping machines. But the ship was warm. The walls were smooth and gentle to the touch. Music played softly from invisible speakers. Everything was designed to make her feel comfortable and safe. She realized later that this was probably on purpose. They wanted the human representatives to be calm when they arrived at the neutral sphere. Dr. Hai-Il was already on the ship. He sat in a white chair, looking at data on a glowing screen. He did not look up when Min Seo entered. He was a serious man, always thinking about physics and mathematics. He had won many prizes for his work. He did not think highly of linguists. He thought that science was the only thing that mattered. Words were just sounds. Languages were just patterns. They meant nothing compared to the laws of the universe. Commander Tai-O arrived an hour later. He was tall and strong, with short dark hair and kind eyes. He shook Min Seo's hand firmly. He treated her like an equal, unlike Dr. Hai-Il, who barely nodded at her. Tai-O had led soldiers into dangerous places. He had made decisions that saved lives. He understood that sometimes you had to trust your instincts when logic was not enough. The 3 of them traveled together for 3 days. The ship moved so fast that everything outside looked like streaks of light. Dr. Hai-Il spent most of the time working on his calculations. He was trying to prepare himself for the test by solving difficult physics problems. Min Seo watched the stars and thought about what awaited them. Tai-O exercised in a small gym on the ship, keeping his body and mind sharp. When they finally arrived at the neutral sphere, Min Seo understood why it was called neutral. The station hung in the middle of empty space, far from any planet or star. It belonged to no one. It was owned and controlled by the Galactic Council, which meant it belonged to everyone. The station was enormous. It was made of a silver metal that seemed to glow with its own light. Ships from 100 different species were already docked there. Some ships were small and sleek. Other ships were huge and blocky. Some ships seemed to be made of crystal. Others looked like they were grown rather than built. 1,000 representatives from 1,000 worlds walked through the corridors of the neutral sphere. The humans were the newest arrivals. Many of the aliens stopped to look at them. Some of them looked curious. Others looked amused, as if humanity's presence was a joke. A tall species called the Zethrans watched the humans with cold eyes. They were known for their perfect logic and their perfect order. They thought humans were too emotional and too unpredictable. A crystalline species that called itself the Collective looked at the humans with something like pity. They were beings made of living crystal, perfectly clear and perfectly geometric. They could process information faster than any other species. They believed that complexity and imprecision were signs of weakness. They looked at humans and saw only chaos. But there was one species that looked at the humans differently. They were called the Cathori. They were ancient beings, older than any other species in the galaxy. Their faces were lined with wisdom. Their eyes held secrets that had been kept for millions of years. An old Cathori named Talves watched Minseo, Dr. Hae-il, and Commander Tayo as they entered the main hall. He watched them the way a teacher watches students on the first day of school. He knew something that the others did not know. He knew that things were about to change. The main hall was filled with light and sound. Representatives from every species stood together, waiting to hear about the challenge. The instructors stood on a raised platform. They were from the oldest and most advanced species in the galaxy. They wore robes that seemed to be made of pure energy. When they spoke, their voices filled the entire hall. The instructors explained the test. There were 7 sealed chambers. In each chamber was a riddle. These riddles had existed for thousands of years. They had never been solved by any species. The being that could solve all 7 riddles would gain access to the archive. The archive contained knowledge that could help any civilization grow and develop for thousands of years into the future. It was a prize that every species wanted. The challenge seemed impossible. Dr. Hae-il's face grew serious. He immediately began thinking about the patterns and structures that riddles usually followed. Commander Tayo started thinking about strategy and planning. He wondered which chamber would be easiest to start with. But Minseo just listened. She listened to the words the instructors used. She listened to the pauses between their words. She listened to what they did not say. She watched how the other species reacted. The Zethrans were already calculating. The crystalline collective was analyzing everything with perfect precision. All around her, the smartest beings in the galaxy were preparing to use their great intelligence to solve ancient mysteries. Minseo thought about stories. She thought about poems. She thought about the way different cultures explain the world through words and images instead of numbers and formulas. She thought about how humans had always been good at seeing things that were not immediately obvious. She thought about riddles that her grandmother had told her when she was a child, and how she had loved the surprise of the answer. Dr. Hae-il looked at her and saw that she was not taking notes like everyone else. "You should be preparing," he said. "This is not a game for people who daydream." Minseo smiled. She was not daydreaming. She was listening in the way that only humans knew how to listen. She was preparing herself not with information, but with intuition. She did not know if this would be enough, but she knew that her way of thinking was different from every other species in this hall. And sometimes, being different was exactly what you needed to find an answer that no one else could find. The instructors announced that the test would begin at sunrise the next morning. The representatives were shown to their chambers where they could rest. As Minseo walked through the corridors of the neutral sphere, she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt ready. She felt like she belonged here. And somehow, she knew that this experience was going to change everything for her, and perhaps for all of humanity as well. The first chamber was vast and empty. The walls were smooth and white. There was nothing inside except a single platform in the center, and on that platform stood the 3 humans. Above them, a voice spoke. It was not angry or kind. It was just a voice. The voice of an ancient machine called synthesis that had existed for longer than any individual could remember. The riddle came in 1,000 languages at the same time. Minseo heard it in Korean and English. She heard it in mathematical symbols and in images made of light. The question was asked over and over in every language that had ever been spoken by any species in the galaxy, but the meaning was always the same. The riddle said this: "I am not alive, yet I grow. I have no lungs, yet I need air. I have no mouth, yet water kills me. What am I?" The chamber filled with the sounds of thinking. not just thinking, but the loud and visible work of problem-solving. The Zethrans had brought machines with them. These machines processed data and created complex mathematical models. They filled screens with numbers and equations. They tried to think of things that grew without being alive. They thought of crystals that formed over time. They thought of stars that expanded as they aged. They thought of storms that grew larger in the atmosphere. Nothing seemed to match all the clues in the riddle. The crystalline collective worked differently. They were the riddle, in a way. Each member of the collective was a separate crystal, but they all thought together as one mind. They analyzed the riddle and broke it down into its smallest parts. They examined each clue like scientists studying a new element. They too generated possibilities, but they all reached the same conclusion. There was no logical answer. The riddle seemed to describe something impossible. How could something that was not alive grow? How could something without lungs need air? It seemed to contradict itself. In the observation gallery above the chamber, the instructors watched. They had seen this challenge presented to thousands of species over thousands of years. They had watched brilliance fail. They had watched species that could process information faster than light itself fail to answer this simple riddle. Talves, the old Cathori, leaned forward with interest. He was watching Minseo. Dr. Hai-Il was thinking about exotic matter. He was thinking about quantum phenomena and parallel dimensions. Maybe the riddle described something that existed between states of being. Maybe it described something from physics that was so unusual that normal species had never encountered it. He began constructing theories about impossible materials and unknown forces. Commander Teo was thinking about the riddle in a different way. He had trained soldiers for decades. He understood that sometimes the enemy would hide their weakness in plain sight. Sometimes the most obvious answer was actually the correct answer, but it was hidden behind layers of confusion. He paced back and forth in the chamber, thinking about what was right in front of him. Hours passed. The Zethrans had filled entire walls with their calculations. The crystalline collective had tried millions of different possibilities. Dr. Hai-Il had created a theoretical model of a new form of matter that might fit the description. But nothing worked. The riddle seemed to hold no answer. Minseo had been quiet. She stood on the platform and listened to the voice of synthesis. She listened to the riddle being repeated again and again in different languages. She did not make notes. She did not create calculations. She did not try to build machines to help her think. She just listened. And then, when the sun had moved halfway across the sky, she opened her eyes and spoke 2 words. "Fire, dust," she said. Silence filled the chamber. The machines of the Zethrans stopped processing. The crystalline collective froze mid-thought. Dr. Hai-Il turned to look at Minseo with confusion on his face. Commander Teo stopped pacing. Even synthesis seemed surprised. The instructors in the observation gallery leaned forward with sudden interest. One of the instructors spoke. He seemed irritated. He said that the riddle required 1 answer, not 2. The test was clear. Find the thing that was not alive yet grew, that needed air but had no lungs, that was killed by water. 1 answer, not 2. Minseo looked up at where the voice came from. "I solved it," she said. "The answer is fire. Fire grows without being alive. Fire needs air to exist. Water kills fire. That is the answer to your riddle. But I also said dust because fire becomes dust. When you think about a riddle, you think about what it describes. Fire is what it describes." The instructors seemed confused. They did not understand why Minseo had given an extra answer that was not asked for. Minseo explained in simple words. "I am a linguist. I study how people use words. This riddle is written like a poem, not like a science problem. When you read a poem, you think about more than just one thing. You think about what the words mean and what they suggest and what they remind you of. Fire describes fire, but it also describes the beginning of fire as dust and the end of fire as ash. A riddle written like this is not asking for logic. It is asking for understanding. Talves nodded slowly. He understood what she meant. The instructors exchanged looks. They said that the answer was acceptable. Fire was correct. The chamber began to change. The smooth white walls became transparent. Behind them, a chamber opened up, and inside was a device. It was made of metal that seemed to be from no planet the humans knew. It was covered in symbols that no one had been able to read in 10,000 years. It was a translator device, and it had been sealed in that chamber since the first species tried and failed this riddle. Synthesis spoke again. It said that the first chamber was complete. The humans had succeeded where 100 other species had only made attempts. The instructors looked at Minseo with new respect. They had expected logic. They had expected calculation. They had received something completely different. They had received human intuition. Dr. Hai-Il looked at Minseo differently now. He was beginning to understand that perhaps science was not the only way to solve problems. Perhaps there were other ways to think, ways that he had not considered before because he believed they were not serious or important. But they had worked here. In this place, in this chamber, in this moment, intuition had succeeded where logic had failed. Commander Tayo smiled at Minseo. He had known that she had something special. He had seen it in the way she listened rather than spoke. He had seen it in the way she thought about things differently than other people. Now the instructors and the other species saw it too. As the three humans walked out of the first chamber, Minseo heard whispers from the other representatives. The Zethrans were recalibrating their approach. The Crystalline Collective was reformulating their strategy. The Cathori, especially Talves, watched Minseo with an expression that seemed like recognition. She had solved the first riddle. But more importantly, she had shown that sometimes the way humans thought was not a weakness. Sometimes it was exactly what the universe needed. The second chamber was different from the first. It was dark and narrow, like a passage inside a mountain. The walls seemed to breathe. When Minseo put her hand on them, they were warm. The voice of synthesis presented the second riddle. The riddle asked this: I follow you everywhere you go, but you can never catch me. I have no body, yet I cast a shadow. I disappear when you are in darkness. What am I? Dr. Hai-Il began to think about the physics of shadows. Shadows were created by light and matter interacting. Shadows were real physical phenomena, not magical or abstract things. He started thinking about particles and waves and how light traveled through space. He wondered if the riddle was describing some kind of exotic particle that mimicked the behavior of shadows, but was actually something else entirely. He created theories about dark matter and quantum field interactions. Commander Teo thought about enemies. He thought about how enemies followed you and waited for you. He thought about threats that could not be caught or captured. He thought about the way soldiers would say they felt shadows of danger. He started thinking about metaphorical shadows, the shadow of war or the shadow of fear. These things followed people everywhere, but could never be truly caught because they were ideas, not physical objects. The Zethrans processed millions of possibilities. The Crystalline Collective analyzed every word. They did not make the same mistake they had made in the first chamber. They tried harder. They thought deeper. They believed that if they just worked long enough, they would find the answer through pure logic. But Minseo simply answered, "Shadows, literal shadows." The instructors were frustrated again. They said that was too simple. The answer could not be that simple. The riddle must be describing something more complex, something that only appeared to be a shadow, but was actually something else, something that had hidden layers of meaning beneath the surface. Minseo remained calm. She explained that the riddle was trying to trick them. It was trying to make them overthink. The riddle asked questions that seemed to describe something impossible. How could something follow you everywhere, but you could never catch it? In reality, shadows did exactly this. Shadows were not things that could be captured. You could not grab a shadow because it was not made of matter. It was made of absence. It was made of the lack of light. When you tried to catch a shadow by reaching for it, your hand would block the light and create a new shadow. This was why the riddle said you could never catch it. The instructors listened. They seemed to begin understanding. Min-seo continued. She said that humans learned to think this way through stories and games. When children were young, they played games where they tried to catch their own shadows. They learned that shadows were not things. They were the result of things. This was basic knowledge to humans, but to species that thought in pure mathematics and logic, it might seem like a hidden mystery. The second chamber opened. Inside was an ancient device that recorded sound. It was an archive of voices from species that no longer existed. It was a treasure beyond measure because it allowed the galaxy to hear words from civilizations that had disappeared millions of years ago. This device had been sealed for longer than any of the other species could measure. By the third chamber, the pattern was becoming clear. The third riddle asked, I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with wind. What am I? Min-seo answered immediately, an echo. The other species were starting to understand. They began to see that these riddles were not designed to trick through complexity. They were designed to trick through misdirection. They were written in ways that made your mind search for difficult and complex answers when the actual answer was simple and obvious. The fourth chamber came next. The riddle asked, I have cities but no houses. I have mountains but no trees. I have water but no fish. What am I? Min-seo said, a map. Each time she answered, the pattern became clearer to everyone watching. The instructors began to look embarrassed. They had not considered that riddles could work like this. They had always approached riddles as if they were testing the limits of intelligence and knowledge. But these riddles were actually testing something else entirely. They were testing the ability to see past overthinking. They were testing the ability to trust your first instinct instead of your last complex calculation. Dr. Hae-il began to see what Min-seo was doing. He started to think like her. When the fifth chamber presented a riddle about something that was always coming but never arrived, he answered with her, tomorrow. When the sixth chamber asked about something that could fill a room but had no body, he said with confidence, light. The Zethrans watched and started to change their approach. They began to stop their machines. They began to try intuition instead of calculation. But they had developed their entire civilization on the foundation of logic and precision. Intuition did not come easily to them. They struggled. The crystalline collective was falling behind. They could not adjust their thinking. They were too deep in their own way of understanding the universe. Each riddle that Min-seo solved made them retreat further into confusion and frustration. Commander Teo began to understand that this test was showing something important about different species. It was showing that the species that had developed their civilization on the foundation of complexity and logic were at a disadvantage here. They had built themselves into a corner. They had trained themselves to think in ways that were useful for building technology and creating order, but these same ways of thinking made it impossible for them to see simple truths. But humans, who were young and had not yet perfected their thinking into rigid patterns, could still move between different ways of understanding. Humans could think logically when they needed to, but they could also think intuitively. They could see both the complex and the simple. They could move between worlds of thought like travelers moving between cities. By the time the humans had opened 6 chambers, the other species were in various states of distress. The Zethrans were arguing with each other. The crystalline collective had stopped moving entirely, frozen in a state of confused calculation. Even the instructors looked uncertain. Talves approached Min-seo when she exited from the 6th chamber. He placed what might have been a hand on her shoulder. "You understand something that we forgot," he said in a voice that was old and carried the weight of ages. You understand that the greatest riddles of the universe are not always solved through thinking. Sometimes they are solved through feeling. Sometimes they are solved through the ability to be wrong and continue forward anyway. Minseo did not understand what he meant yet, but she would soon. The seventh chamber was waiting, and inside the seventh chamber was the question that would change everything. The seventh chamber was nothing like the others. When Minseo, Dr. Hai-Il, and Commander Tae-O entered, there were no words. There was no voice speaking a riddle in 1,000 languages. There was only silence and images. The first image appeared in front of them. It showed a star that was dying. The star was red and angry, and it was collapsing inward. Its light was fading. Its energy was being consumed by something invisible. As they watched, the star became smaller and dimmer until finally it vanished completely, leaving only darkness. The second image appeared. It was a clock, but the clock was broken. The hands had fallen off. The face was shattered. Numbers were missing. But even though it was broken, the clock still ticked. Each tick made a sound like something small breaking again and again. The clock would never measure time correctly again. It would never show the real time, but it would continue to tick forever. The third image was different. It was gentle and warm. It showed an old person, someone who had lived for many years. Their hands were wrinkled and spotted with age. Those hands were being held by a small child. The child's hands were smooth and perfect. The old hands held the young hands so carefully, as if they were holding something more precious than anything else in the universe. There was love in this image. There was also sadness, because the old hands would someday release the young hands. The old person would go away, and the young person would be left holding the memory of that touch. The fourth image showed a door. The door was opening, but beyond the door was another door. That second door was also opening, but beyond that was a third door. The doors seemed to continue forever into infinity, each door opening to show another door behind it. There was no end to it. There was no final destination. There was only the endless pattern of doors opening to more doors. The fifth image was the most difficult to understand. It was a mirror reflecting another mirror, but the mirrors reflected nothing. They were empty. They showed no image at all. They just reflected emptiness back and forth infinitely. Looking at the image made the mind feel strange and lost, because there was nothing to hold on to. There was no person looking in the mirror. There was no thing being reflected. There was only the endless reflection of nothing. Then the images stopped. The chamber became silent. Nothing else happened. No voice told them they had answered correctly. No chamber opened to reveal a prize. The instructors were expecting the humans to ask for the riddle to be repeated. They were expecting confusion. They were expecting the humans to eventually admit they did not understand what they were supposed to do. But Minseo closed her eyes. She stood very still. She thought about her grandmother, who had told her stories when she was a child. She thought about the way her grandmother had explained death to her. Her grandmother had said that death was not an ending but a transformation. She thought about the way people said things like, "Life is like a journey," or "Time is a river," or "Love is a bridge." These were not literal truths, but they were true in a different way. They captured something real about the experience of being alive. She thought about the dying star, which represented the ending of all things. She thought about the broken clock, which represented the way that time did not always work the way you expected it to. She thought about the old hands and the young hands, which represented connection and love and the passing of time between people. She thought about the endless doors, which represented possibility, and the way that every choice led to more choices. She thought about the empty mirrors, which represented the way that sometimes you could not see yourself clearly. Then she opened her eyes, and she spoke. "The riddle is that there is no riddle," she said. "These images are not a puzzle to solve. They are a question about existence itself. You are asking us to understand something about what it means to be alive. You are showing us all the things that are part of human experience, beginning and ending, time passing, love and loss, choice and possibility, searching for meaning even when there might not be any meaning to find. The chamber began to move. The walls vibrated. Lights flashed across the surface. The instructors above looked startled. Their instruments were showing readings that had never appeared in the history of this test. Synthesis spoke, but its voice was different now. It sounded almost like it had feelings. "You have understood not the puzzle," Synthesis said, "but the purpose. The architects of these chambers built them thousands of years ago. They built them because they wanted to know if any species could understand that not all questions had answers. Not all challenges required solving. Sometimes the answer was acceptance. Sometimes the answer was recognition. Sometimes the answer was simply the ability to see something and understand it as a whole, rather than breaking it down into smaller pieces." The seventh chamber opened. Inside was something that made the other species recoil in shock. It was a memory core. It was a device that contained the memories and consciousness of beings that had lived millions of years ago. It held the wisdom of civilizations that had come and gone before even the Cathori walked among the stars. It was perhaps the most valuable object in the entire galaxy, but Min Seo understood that this was not really a prize. The real prize was something else. The real prize was that humanity had proven something. They had proven that they could think differently. They could see past the obvious path and find the hidden path. They could move between logical thinking and intuitive thinking without becoming trapped in either one. Dr. Hayail placed his hand on Minseo's shoulder. He was not a man who showed emotion easily, but now he looked at her with something like respect and wonder. "I did not believe this would work," he said. "I did not believe that the answers could be so simple. I have spent my entire life looking for complexity. I thought that complexity was the mark of truth. But you have shown me that sometimes the simplest answer is the truest one." Commander Teo stood in silence for a moment. Then he spoke to the instructors above. "We did not solve these riddles because we are smarter than other species," he said. "We solved them because we are different. We think differently. We see things differently. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is our gift. That is what makes humanity worth something in this galaxy." The instructors exchanged looks. They looked at Talves. The old Cathori was nodding slowly. He had known this was coming. He had waited for this moment for so long that he had almost stopped believing it would ever happen. Talves spoke to the three humans. His voice carried the weight of ages. "You have done something that no species has done in the history of this test. You have opened all 7 chambers. You have proven that the way of thinking that the ancient architects valued is still possible. It is still alive somewhere in the galaxy. We thought it was dead. We thought it had been replaced by logic and calculation and the endless pursuit of perfect knowledge. But you have shown us that it still exists. It exists in humanity." The other species watched as the 7 chambers began to glow with light. Each chamber released the knowledge it had been holding. It flooded out into the neutral sphere, into the waiting hands of all the species that had been striving to learn these secrets. The greatest archive of knowledge in the galaxy had been opened, and it had been opened by the humans, the youngest species, the ones that all the others had thought would fail. But as the knowledge spread, one thing became clear to everyone. The most valuable knowledge was not the technological secrets or the scientific discoveries. The most valuable knowledge was the discovery that there were multiple ways to think. There were multiple ways to understand the universe, and the universe was large enough and strange enough to require all of these different ways of thinking. The observation gallery was in chaos. The instructors were arguing with each other. Some of them could not believe what had happened. Some of them were angry because the test had ended before they expected it to end. Some of them were confused because they did not understand how the humans had succeeded where everyone else had failed. But Talves stood quietly. He was watching Minseo through the transparent wall. The other representatives of the galaxy were also in shock. The Zethrans had shut down all of their machines. They were standing in silence, unable to process what had happened. The crystalline collective had frozen completely. They were not moving at all. There was no way to know what they were thinking or feeling. The other species were watching each other, wondering what this meant for the galaxy. If humans could solve these riddles so easily, what did that say about the advancement of all the other species? Talves left the observation gallery and walked down to the chamber where the humans were standing. He moved slowly, the way that very old creatures move when they have been alive for so long that time itself seems to move differently around them. When he reached Minseo, he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "Come with me," he said. "There is something you need to understand." He led the three humans to a private room in the neutral sphere. The room was quiet and peaceful. It was decorated with images from 1,000 different worlds. Each image showed a moment of beauty or importance from a different civilization. Talves gestured for them to sit. "The test that you have just completed is not new," Talves said. "It has existed for 1,000 years. We have given this test to species from every corner of the galaxy. Thousands of species have tried. Thousands of species have sent their brightest representatives to answer these riddles. None of them have ever succeeded in opening all 7 chambers. Until today. Until you." Dr. High-Ill leaned forward. "I do not understand," he said. "The first chambers seemed simple once we understood the pattern. How could no other species have solved them?" Talves smiled. "Because you are thinking about this wrong. The riddles were not difficult because they were complex. The riddles were difficult because they were simple. They were difficult because the other species could not accept that the answer could be so obvious." He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the galaxy stretched into infinity. Stars were scattered like dust across the darkness. "Let me tell you about the species that came before your species became spacefaring," Talves said. "The Zethrans arrived at this test 300 years ago. They brought machines that could process information faster than light itself. They believed that if they could just calculate fast enough, they could find the answer. They created equations and models. They tested millions of possibilities. They never once considered that the answer might be as simple as fire or shadows or light. Their minds had been trained to see complexity as the mark of truth, and so they saw no answer." Talves turned back to face them. "The crystalline collective arrived 200 years ago. They are beings made of crystal and light. They are perfect in ways that you cannot imagine. Their thoughts are clear and ordered and logical. Every part of them functions with absolute precision. But this precision is also their weakness. They cannot embrace contradiction. They cannot accept that something could be both alive and not alive. They cannot understand paradox. And so they saw no answer." He sat back down. "Every species that has come here has been trapped by the way they think. They have been trapped by their own perfection. The Zethrans are trapped by their logic. The collective is trapped by their precision. The other species are trapped by different things, by their obsession with order, by their lack of imagination, by their fear of being wrong." Commander Teo began to understand. "And humans?" he asked. "What are humans trapped by?" Talves looked at him carefully. "That is the interesting question. I will tell you what I have learned about humanity. You are trapped by something, but it is a different kind of trap. You are trapped by your awareness of your own limitations. You are afraid of being wrong. You doubt yourself. You are uncertain about your place in the universe. These things are weaknesses in many situations, but in this test, they became your strength." Minseo was listening intently. She could feel that Talves was explaining something important. "You see," Talves continued. When you did not immediately understand the answer, you did not panic. When the answer was not obvious, you did not retreat into complex calculations. You remained open. You remained willing to be surprised. You were willing to accept that the answer might be simpler than you expected. And most importantly, you were willing to trust your intuition even when you could not explain it logically. Dr. Hay-Il was starting to see what Talves meant. You are saying that we solve the riddles not because we are smarter than other species, he said slowly, but because we are willing to think in ways that other species have trained themselves to avoid. Exactly, Talves said. The ancient architects of these chambers understood something important. They understood that the universe does not always reward pure logic or pure precision or pure order. The universe also rewards intuition and imagination and the willingness to embrace uncertainty. They created these riddles as a test to see if any species had maintained this balance. They wanted to know if any species had remained flexible enough to think in multiple ways. Talves stood and walked to another window. For 1,000 years we thought that this balance had been lost. We thought that all species eventually evolved to choose one way of thinking over all others. We thought that species would pursue logic to the exclusion of intuition, or pursue order to the exclusion of chaos. We thought that the path of evolution was always toward greater specialization and greater perfection in a single direction. But then, humanity arrived. Humanity, which is young and new, and still uncertain of its place in the galaxy. He turned back to face them. Humanity has not yet decided what it wants to be. You are still finding your way. You still value different things in different situations. You can think logically when you need to, but you can also think creatively. You can value precision, but you can also embrace ambiguity. You are not yet trapped by your own perfection. This is why you succeeded where all the others failed. Commander Teo spoke. What happens now? The test is over. We have opened all 7 chambers. Will there be a final test? Talves looked away from the window and faced the humans directly. His ancient eyes held something that might have been joy. There is a final chamber. It has never been opened. It has been sealed for longer than any of us can remember. The architects of this test built it as a question, not as a challenge. No one has ever made it to this final chamber before, but now you have. Now you will have the opportunity to answer the most important question in the universe. Dr. Hay-Il felt a chill run through him. What is the question? He asked. Talves smiled. I cannot tell you. The question must come to you in the chamber itself. But I can tell you this. The question is not about what you know. It is not about how smart you are. It is not about your ability to solve puzzles or create equations. The question is about what you are willing to sacrifice. The question is about what you are willing to give up for beings that you have never met. The question is about what you are willing to do for the future of a galaxy that may never know your name. He gestured toward the door. The final chamber is waiting. It is time for humanity to answer the last question. It is time for you to discover what makes your species worth protecting. It is time for you to find out what your species will choose to become.